The scream ripped through the antiseptic air, a raw, animalistic sound that clawed at Ellie Vance's focus. One moment, the fluorescent lights of Hopewell General's outpatient pharmacy hummed with a mundane efficiency, the rhythmic beep of the scanner, a familiar soundtrack to her end-of-shift task. The next, the world fractured. He burst through the automatic doors like a storm front, a figure etched in panic, the glint of steel in his trembling hand reflecting the harsh overhead lighting. His eyes, wild and desperate, scanned the confined space, landing with terrifying finality on the quiet man standing a few feet from Ellie, waiting for his prescription. Dr. Eris Thorne. "Everyone down! Now!" the gunman roared, his voice cracking under the strain. The pharmacy tech, a young woman named Sarah who Ellie had seen just that morning nervously prepping for her pharmacology exam, crumpled to the linoleum floor, a stifled sob escaping her lips. Ellie froze for a heartbeat, her mind struggling to reconcile the normalcy of the setting with the sheer terror radiating from the intruder. Then, the world tilted again, a sickening thud, followed by a wet, ragged cough. Thorne stumbled, his hand clutching his midsection, a dark bloom spreading rapidly across his crisp white shirt. The gunman, seemingly as shocked as everyone else, recoiled slightly. "Damn it," he hissed, his grip tightening on the weapon. I didn't mean to." Chaos erupted. The pharmacy tech's whimpers intensified. The gunman, his control visibly fraying, started yelling demands for a car, for safe passage, for the police to back off. Outside, the muffled sounds of shouting and the first faint wail of sirens began to bleed through the heavy security doors that slammed shut with a resounding clang, sealing them inside. Ellie's training kicked in, a cold wave of professionalism washing over the initial shock. Forget the screaming, forget the gun, forget her own rising panic. There was a man bleeding out in front of her. Thorne sank to his knees, his face contorted in agony. The dark stain on his shirt grew larger, a crimson tide seeping through his fingers. His breathing became shallow, rapid gasps. Ellie knew, with a chilling certainty, that every second counted. "He needs help," she stated, her voice surprisingly steady, cutting through the gunman's frantic shouts. He whirled around, the gun now pointed directly at her. "Stay back! Don't move!" "He's going into shock," Ellie continued, her gaze fixed on Thorne. His skin was already losing color, a ghastly pallor spreading across his features. "If he doesn't get medical attention now, he's going to die." The gunman hesitated, his eyes flicking between Ellie and the rapidly weakening hostage. His leverage was fading with every drop of blood staining the floor. "The cops," they said. "No one comes in." "And they won't," Ellie said, her mind racing, assessing the limited resources around her. Bandages, antiseptic, over-the-counter pain relievers, nothing that could stop internal bleeding. "But I'm a nurse, I can try to stabilize him. You need him alive." A flicker of something, desperation, perhaps a sliver of reluctant understanding, crossed the gunman's face. "Don't try anything." Ellie nodded slowly, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. She moved cautiously towards Thorne, dropping to her knees beside him. His eyes flickered open, a silent plea in their depths. "I'm here," she murmured, her voice low and reassuring, the same tone she used with frightened children in the pediatric ward. "We're going to do everything we can." Her fingers, nimble and practiced, gently probed Thorne's abdomen. The entry wound was small, almost deceptively so, but the extent of the internal damage was impossible to ascertain without imaging. The rapidly expanding area of discoloration hinted at significant internal bleeding. His breathing was becoming more labored, his chest rising and falling unevenly. "Pharmacy tech," Ellie called out, her voice gaining authority. "Sarah, can you hear me?" The young woman sniffled, her eyes wide with terror. "Yes? I need you to be brave for me. Can you find any antiseptic wipes? Gauze? Anything to cover the wound?" Sarah, spurred by the direct request, scrambled to her feet, her fear momentarily overshadowed by a need to be useful. She frantically began pulling supplies from the shelves. Ellie focused on Thorne. "What's your name?" "Eris," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Eris, I'm Ellie. We're going to keep talking, okay? Tell me what happened." She needed to keep him conscious, to monitor his mental status. "Fleeing, store," he managed, his words punctuated by pained breaths. Sarah returned with a handful of antiseptic towelettes and a box of gauze pads. Ellie quickly cleaned the entry wound, though she knew it was a superficial measure. The real danger was inside. Then, she noticed it. Thorne's breathing was becoming increasingly strained, his chest rising less and less with each inhalation. A cold dread washed over her. Given the location of the gunshot wound, there was a high probability of a pneumothorax, air trapped in the pleural space, compressing his lung. If it was a tension pneumothorax, where air was entering but couldn't escape, it would kill him within minutes. She needed to act, and she needed to act now. But how? They were trapped. There were no chest tubes, no needles large enough to decompress the pressure. Just over-the-counter remedies and office supplies. Her gaze swept frantically across the small pharmacy. Her eyes landed on the pharmacist's cluttered desk. A standard office binder lay open, a few loose papers held together by a simple metal paperclip. An idea, audacious and desperate, sparked in her mind. It was insane. It was a massive violation of every medical protocol she had ever learned. It was quite possibly his only chance. "Gunman," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "He has a collapsed lung. I need to do something, and I don't have the right tools." The gunman looked at her, suspicion clouding his features. "What are you talking about?" "I need something thin and strong, something I can sterilize," Ellie explained quickly, her mind already racing through the steps. "And something to close the small incision I'll need to make." He frowned, clearly not understanding. Ellie pointed to the desk. "That paperclip? Can you get it for me?" He hesitated, his eyes darting towards the security cameras in the corner. "What the hell are you going to do with a paperclip?" "I'm going to try and save his life," Ellie said simply, her focus entirely on Eris Thorne, whose breathing was now shallow, ragged gasps. His lips were starting to turn blue. Time was running out. The gunman, seeing the urgency in her face and the rapidly deteriorating condition of his hostage, finally relented. He snatched the paperclip from the binder and tossed it towards her. It clattered on the linoleum floor. Ellie picked it up, her mind already working. It was too flimsy, too prone to bending. She needed something more substantial. Her gaze fell on a small toolkit tucked under the counter near the cash register, likely for minor repairs. "The pliers," she said. "Can you get me the small pliers from that kit?" Again, the gunman hesitated, but the desperation in the air was palpable. He retrieved the pliers and tossed them to her as well. Now, the real challenge. Sterilization. She needed to minimize the risk of infection. Her eyes scanned the shelves again. Rubbing alcohol, yes. She grabbed a bottle and thoroughly soaked the paperclip. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best she could do. Next, she needed to modify the paperclip. Using the small pliers, her hands, surprisingly steady now, began to bend the metal. She carefully straightened it, then bent the very tip into a small, crude hook. It wasn't a surgical needle, not by a long shot, but it was the best she could improvise. For thread, her eyes landed on a bundle of network cables, snaking along the baseboard under the pharmacist's desk. Thin, relatively strong, and coated in a smooth plastic. With the small wire cutters in the toolkit, she snipped off a short length and carefully began to strip away the outer coating, revealing the fine, thread-like wires inside. They weren't sterile, but they were thin enough. "What are you doing?" the gunman asked, his voice a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Ellie didn't answer. Her focus was absolute. She explained to Eris what she was going to try to do, keeping her voice calm and reassuring, even though her own heart was pounding in her chest. "It's going to hurt, Eris, but I need you to stay as still as you can." Using an antiseptic wipe, she cleaned a small area on Eris's chest, just below the gunshot wound, based on her knowledge of anatomy and the likely trajectory of the bullet. Taking a deep breath, she positioned the makeshift needle. This was it. There was no turning back. With a silent prayer, Ellie pushed the sharpened end of the paperclip through Eris's skin. He cried out, a strangled gasp of pain, his body arching against the floor. Ellie held him firmly, her other hand pressing down to stabilize the area. It was crude, brutal, and agonizingly slow. The metal wasn't sharp enough. It tore rather than pierced cleanly. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Finally, the tip emerged on the other side. She carefully threaded one of the thin wires through the loop she had created. Then, with painstaking slowness, she pulled the makeshift needle back through, leaving the wire suture in place. She repeated the process, placing 2 more crude stitches, just enough to hold the edges of a small incision together. It wasn't enough to close the internal damage, but it might be enough to create a small opening to relieve the trapped air. Using a pen from the pharmacist's desk, she carefully widened the small entry point of one of the paperclip sutures. A hiss of air escaped. Eris gasped, a small measure of color returning to his face. His breathing seemed slightly less labored. It wasn't a proper decompression. It wasn't a chest tube. But it was something. It was a desperate improvisation born of necessity. Using the gauze pads and medical tape Sarah had provided, Ellie fashioned a three-sided occlusive dressing, taping it securely over the original gunshot wound to prevent more air from entering while hopefully allowing any trapped air to escape through the untaped side. Eris's breathing, while still shallow, was no longer the panicked gasps of moments before. His color was improving, albeit marginally. He was still alive. A tense silence descended upon the pharmacy. The gunman watched Ellie, his weapon still raised but his posture slightly less rigid. Sarah huddled in a corner, her sobs now reduced to quiet sniffles. Outside, the sirens wailed closer. A voice boomed through a megaphone, demanding the gunman's surrender. "He's stable. For now," Ellie said, her voice hoarse, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. "He needs a real hospital, real doctors." The gunman seemed to deflate slightly, the fight draining out of him. He looked at Eris, then at Ellie, then at the ceiling. He knew this couldn't end any other way. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, I give up." He slowly placed his weapon on the counter, his hands shaking violently. The security gates whirred open, and the pharmacy doors burst inward. A phalanx of heavily armed SWAT officers flooded the room, their weapons trained on the surrendered gunman. Paramedics rushed past them, their eyes widening as they took in the scene. The blood on the floor, the terrified pharmacy tech, Eris Thorne lying pale but breathing, and Ellie, kneeling beside him, her hands still hovering protectively over the makeshift dressing on his chest. One of the paramedics, a grizzled veteran with tired eyes, looked at the crude paperclip stitches, then up at Ellie, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. "Holy," he breathed, shaking his head. Eris Thorne was carefully transferred to a stretcher and rushed towards the waiting ambulance, a team of paramedics working frantically around him. Detective Frank Harding arrived, pushing his way through the chaos. His face was grim, his eyes cold as they landed on Ellie. He didn't see a hero. He saw an interference. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, his voice sharp and accusatory. "Did you touch him? This is a crime scene. You've contaminated everything. You had no right to interfere. You're coming with me." Before Ellie could even process the sudden shift, before she could register the paramedics' surprised glances or Sarah's wide, fearful eyes, she was being pulled away, the scent of antiseptic and blood clinging to her, replaced by the cold, sterile air of the hallway, the click of handcuffs, a stark punctuation mark on her unexpected descent from lifesaver to suspect. The rage, for anyone watching, was beginning to simmer. The back of the police cruiser was cold and impersonal. The vinyl seat stuck to Ellie's skin, and the acrid smell of stale coffee and industrial air freshener filled the small space. Through the wire mesh partition, she watched the city lights of Metropolis smear into streaks of neon and gold, a world she was suddenly no longer a part of. The weight of the metal cuffs on her wrists was a constant, chilling reminder of her new reality. Just an hour ago, she had held a man's life in her hands, her mind a razor-sharp instrument of focus and improvisation. Now, that same mind was a maelstrom of confusion, exhaustion, and a creeping, icy dread. The precinct was a monument to weary bureaucracy. The paint on the walls was a shade of despair somewhere between beige and gray, and the air hummed with the low buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant, tinny ring of a telephone. Detective Harding led her not to a waiting room, but down a long, echoing corridor to a small, windowless room containing nothing but a scarred metal table and 3 chairs. He gestured for her to sit, the sound of the heavy door closing behind them unnervingly final. He removed the handcuffs with a perfunctory click, but made no other move to put her at ease. He sat opposite her, dropping a thin file onto the table. It made a sharp slap in the quiet room. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his expression unreadable but for the profound tiredness in his eyes. This was not a man seeking truth. This was a man seeking to close a file. Elara Vance, 26, registered nurse at Hopewell General for the last 3 years, no priors. Commendation for your work during the downtown gas line explosion last year. He recited the facts without inflection, as if reading an ingredients list. So you're a good nurse, Miss Vance. People say you're one of the best. Ellie swallowed, her throat dry. I try to be. You're trained in sterile procedure, I assume? You understand concepts like cross-contamination, antiseptic fields, proper wound closure? Yes, of course. Harding nodded slowly, a predator circling its prey. And yet, he said, his voice dropping, when faced with a crisis, your training led you to use a common office paperclip, likely covered in microscopic filth, and a piece of plastic-coated wire you ripped from a wall to perform an unlicensed surgical procedure on a hostage in the middle of a police standoff. Does that sound like the actions of a trained medical professional to you? The question hung in the air, thick and accusatory. Ellie felt a flush of anger rise in her chest, but she pushed it down, clinging to the calm that had served her so well in the pharmacy. There was no other choice. He was dying. He had a tension pneumothorax. His lung was collapsing. His heart was being compressed. He had minutes, maybe less. That's your diagnosis? A field diagnosis made under duress, with a gun pointed at you? Harding countered, his tone laced with skepticism. Did you have an X-ray machine in there I don't know about? Did you run any tests? I saw the tracheal deviation, the asymmetrical chest movement, the cyanosis. The signs were classic. There was no time to wait. Waiting is what we do, Ms. Vance, Harding snapped, his composure finally cracking. We wait, we negotiate, we de-escalate. We have a protocol for these situations. A protocol developed over decades to maximize the preservation of life for everyone involved. And you, in a fit of what I can only assume was reckless hubris, decided your protocol was better. You threw a grenade into the middle of a delicate operation. A grenade? I saved his life. Ellie's voice rose, the injustice of his words stinging more than any physical blow. You think you saved his life, Harding corrected, pointing a thick finger at her. What you did was assault him with a piece of metal. You introduced a massive vector for infection. What if he dies on the operating table from sepsis because of you? Who's responsible then? What if you had nicked an artery and he bled out faster? You got lucky, Ms. Vance. You gambled with another man's life, and for now, it seems you won. But the city doesn't run on luck. It runs on procedure. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. And let's talk about the crime scene. The bullet, the blood spatter, the positioning of the body, all of that is evidence. Evidence you disturbed, moved, and contaminated. You've made the prosecution's job 100 times harder. You tied the hands of the negotiators who were, I assure you, moments away from a peaceful resolution. Ellie stared at him, bewildered. He was painting a picture of a world so inverted, so divorced from the reality she had experienced, that she felt dizzy. He spoke of procedures and evidence while she spoke of a dying man's blue lips. They weren't even in the same conversation. He shot him, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The gunman shot him. That's what started all of this. And we would have dealt with that. But you couldn't wait. You had to play hero. He opened the file and pushed a form towards her. This is your official statement. Write down everything that happened. Every single detail. And I mean everything. The type of paperclip, where you found the lighter, every word you said to the hostage. He paused, his gaze hardening. I'm not charging you tonight, Ms. Vance, but you are under official investigation for reckless endangerment, obstruction of a police investigation, and practicing medicine without a license. This report will determine our next steps. I'd advise you not to leave town. We'll be in touch. He stood and walked to the door, leaving her alone in the sterile, silent room with a cheap ballpoint pen and the impossible task of translating an act of desperate compassion into the cold, bureaucratic language of a police report. The exhaustion hit her then, a crushing weight. She had walked into that pharmacy a nurse. She was walking out a suspect. The drive home in a taxi was a blur. Ellie's small second-floor apartment, usually her sanctuary from the structured chaos of the hospital, felt alien and confining. The cheerful yellow pillows on her couch seemed to mock her. The photos of her smiling with her family on the mantel felt like images from another person's life. She showered, letting the hot water sluice away the grime and the phantom scent of blood and fear, but it couldn't wash away the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Sleep was a distant country she couldn't reach. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Eris Thorne's pale face, heard the wet cough, felt the sickening resistance of skin against the unsharpened paperclip. She was drifting in a state of traumatic limbo when her phone, silent for hours, buzzed on the nightstand. She expected it to be her mother, or perhaps a concerned friend from work. The caller ID read, Hopewell General Administration. A woman's voice, crisp and devoid of emotion, was on the other end. Miss Vance, this is Catherine from Human Resources. Mr. Mark Davenport's office requires you to come in for a meeting this morning at 10 o'clock. It is mandatory. Mark Davenport, the hospital's director of risk management. Ellie had seen him only a few times, a specter in an impeccably tailored suit, striding through the halls with an air of detached authority. He was the man you saw only when something had gone very, very wrong. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She arrived at the administrative wing of the hospital at 9:55 a.m. This wasn't the familiar, chaotic world of the ER, with its symphony of beeps and urgent calls. This was a realm of polished wood, silent carpets, and hushed, important-sounding conversations. Davenport's office was on the top floor, a corner suite with a panoramic view of the city skyline. It was the view of a king from his castle. Davenport wasn't alone. He sat behind a vast, empty mahogany desk, and on either side of him sat two other people in dark suits, a man and a woman, their faces grim and unsmiling. The hospital's legal counsel. Ms. Vance, thank you for coming, Davenport said, his voice as smooth and cold as the glass tabletop between them. He didn't stand. He didn't offer her a seat. He gestured vaguely to a lone chair positioned uncomfortably far from the desk, forcing her to feel like a child called to the principal's office. Ellie sat, her hands clutching her purse in her lap. The silence stretched, a calculated tool of intimidation. Finally, Davenport steepled his fingers, his gaze analytical, as if he were examining a flawed piece of equipment. I've read Detective Harding's preliminary report, he began, and I've had a detailed conversation with him this morning. I must say, Mrs. Vance, in my 12 years in this position, I have never encountered a situation of such profound, self-initiated liability. Ellie opened her mouth to speak, but he held up a hand, silencing her. Let me be perfectly clear about what has transpired, he continued, his tone condescendingly patient. You, an employee of this hospital, while on hospital grounds, performed an invasive, non-consensual, and wholly unauthorized procedure on a civilian using unsterilized office equipment. You did this against the explicit orders of law enforcement, and in direct violation of dozens of state health codes and hospital policies designed, I might add, for the express purpose of preventing this exact kind of catastrophic misjudgment. The words were like a volley of stones, each one hitting its mark. He was dying, she managed to say, her voice small. The police weren't doing anything. He would have died. The female lawyer shifted, her expression one of mild annoyance. Ms. Vance, she said, her voice sharp, your speculative diagnosis is irrelevant. What is relevant is that your actions have opened this hospital up to a lawsuit of potentially devastating magnitude. Dr. Thorny or his estate, had your gamble not paid off, could sue this institution for malpractice, for assault, for negligence, and given the circumstances, they would win handily. Davenport nodded in agreement. Our entire operational model is predicated on mitigating risk. We have insurance, yes, but our premiums, our accreditation, our very reputation are built on adherence to established, tested, and legally defensible protocols. Your improvisation, as I believe the paramedics charitably called it, has jeopardized all of that. He sounded like he was discussing a stock market fluctuation, not a human life. The disconnect was staggering. So what you're saying, Ellie said, a dangerous calm settling over her, is that I should have let him die. That letting a man die according to protocol would have been better for the hospital's bottom line than saving his life against it. Davenport's eyes narrowed. For the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion annoyance crossed his face. What I am saying, Ms. Vance, is that your job is not to be a hero. Your job is to be a nurse within the rigorously defined parameters of your employment. You are a cog in a very large, very complex, and very expensive machine. You are not licensed to be its rogue mechanic. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It landed just out of her reach, forcing her to lean forward to retrieve it. Effective immediately, you are suspended indefinitely, without pay, pending the results of a full internal investigation as well as the police investigation. You are not to enter hospital grounds unless explicitly summoned. You are not to speak to the press or make any public statements regarding this incident. You are to have no contact with Dr. Thorne or his family. Is that understood? The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Suspended. Her career, her livelihood, her entire identity stripped away in a cold, glass-walled office. "I saved his life," she repeated, the words feeling futile and hollow now. Davenport leaned back, a look of finality on his face. He delivered the line that would echo in her mind for days, the single most infuriating, soul-crushing statement she had ever heard. "You exposed this hospital to a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, Miss Vance," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any humanity. "Whether he lived or died is, from a risk management perspective, a secondary concern to the manner in which you intervened." Silence. The hum of the city outside was the only sound. In that moment, Ellie didn't just feel angry or wronged. She felt like she had glimpsed the true, monstrous face of the system she had dedicated her life to, and it was a face that cared for nothing but itself. The male lawyer spoke up for the first time, his voice dry as dust. "We will require a full written report of your actions by the end of the day tomorrow. Be thorough. It is in your best interest to cooperate fully." It was clear what he meant. The report wasn't for understanding her actions, but for building the hospital's legal case that would almost certainly paint her as a reckless, insubordinate employee whose actions were her own, completely divorced from the institution of Hopewell General. They weren't just suspending her. They were disowning her. They were preparing to sacrifice her to save themselves. Ellie stood up, her legs trembling slightly. She looked from Davenport's cold, dismissive face to the impassive masks of his lawyers. There was nothing more to say. She had walked into that room a hero in her own mind. She was walking out an outcast, a liability. The war for her career, she now realized, had just begun. Leaving the administrative wing of Hopewell General was like passing through an invisible membrane into a foreign country. The hospital, a place that had been the center of her universe, now felt alien and hostile. The familiar faces of nurses and orderlies she passed in the main corridor averted their gazes. She saw a flicker of pity in some, morbid curiosity in others, and a cold, unmistakable judgment in a few. The whispers started before she even reached the main entrance, a low murmur that felt like a physical force at her back. She was no longer Ellie Vance, the competent and compassionate nurse. She was a contamination, a problem, a cautionary tale spreading through the hospital's nervous system. She walked the 12 blocks back to her apartment, the city's noise a welcome distraction from the roar in her own head. But once inside, with the door locked behind her, the silence was deafening. It was a vacuum, soon to be filled by the storm she knew was coming. She made the mistake that anyone in her position would make. She sought information. She wanted to see what the world was saying, clinging to a naive hope that the truth of her actions, a man was alive because of her would be the prevailing narrative. She opened her laptop, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed "Hopewell General Hostage" into the search bar. The first headline from a major city news outlet felt like a punch to the gut. Hero or hazard? Hopewell nurse under investigation for paperclip surgery after hostage drama. Her breath hitched. Hazard? The word was a branding iron. She clicked the link, her heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The article was a masterpiece of curated condemnation. It quoted an anonymous source high up in law enforcement, who spoke of a compromised crime scene and a reckless circumvention of established police procedure. It mentioned her unauthorized intervention that needlessly complicated a delicate negotiation. Then came the hospital's contribution. A spokesperson for Hopewell General, a name carefully omitted, was quoted as saying the hospital was deeply concerned by the incident and that a rigorous internal review was underway to ensure all patient safety protocols were, and continue to be, strictly followed. The story painted a picture of a rogue, emotional amateur who got lucky. The fact that Eris Thorne was alive was framed not as a success, but as a fortunate outcome despite her actions. His survival was a footnote. Her insubordination was the headline. That was only the beginning. The article was the spark, and social media was the accelerant. She scrolled down and saw the story had been shared thousands of times. The comments section was a cesspool of instant judgment. Fire her. Immediately. You can't have nurses thinking they're Rambo. So she gets to break all the rules and gets called a hero? What about the cops who are trained for this? Back the blue? Procedure is there for a reason? I'm a nurse, and this is appalling. You never use unsterilized equipment. She should lose her license forever. Paperclip nurse is a menace. There were some voices of support, lost in the flood. Are you all crazy? She saved his life. The man was dying. But they were drowned out by the tide of outrage, fueled by the official-sounding sources in the article. The hashtag, paperclip nurse, was trending. A wave of nausea washed over her. She slammed the laptop shut, but it was too late. The poison was in. She felt exposed, stripped bare, and judged by millions of people who had read a few hundred biased words and believed they knew her soul. Her phone began to buzz incessantly, a number she didn't recognize. Then another, and another. Reporters. She silenced it, but the screen kept lighting up with notifications, Facebook tags, Twitter mentions, a deluge of digital vitriol. She retreated to her couch, wrapping a blanket around herself, as if she could ward off the invisible assault. She flipped on the television, seeking the mindless comfort of a daytime show, but her ordeal was inescapable. It was the lead story on the midday news. A panel of experts was already dissecting her. A stern-looking law enforcement analyst echoed Detective Harding's points almost verbatim. You cannot have civilians interfering in active tactical situations. It endangers the hostage, it endangers the officers, and it endangers the perpetrator, limiting our options for a peaceful surrender. A woman introduced as a medical ethicist chimed in, her face a mask of grave concern. The bedrock of medicine is first, do no harm. While her intentions may have been noble, the act of using unsterilized, makeshift tools constitutes a profound violation of that oath. It sets a terrifying precedent. Ellie screamed at the television, a raw, frustrated sound. He was dying! Do you not understand? There was no other option. But the polished, confident faces on the screen couldn't hear her. They debated her actions as a theoretical exercise, a fascinating case study, completely detached from the life-or-death reality of that pharmacy floor. The final, most devastating blow came later that evening. She was channel surfing, numbly trying to find anything else when she saw his face, Mark Davenport. He was standing in front of Hopewell General, a forest of microphones pointed at him, his expression one of sober, executive concern. He was giving a live press conference. "Good evening," he began, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. "First and foremost, our thoughts and prayers are with Dr. Eris Thorne and his family during this difficult time. We are immensely grateful that he is stable and receiving the finest medical care in the world right here at Hopewell General." He paused, letting the weight of his compassion settle. Naturally, an incident of this severity raises many questions. I want to assure the public that we have launched a comprehensive internal review into the events that transpired. Hopewell General has, for over a century, been a pillar of this community, built on a foundation of trust and an unwavering commitment to patient safety. Here it comes, Ellie thought, her body tensing. The actions of individuals, however, do not always reflect the stringent values and protocols of the institution, Davenport continued, his eyes finding the camera with unerring precision. The choices made by Nurse Alara Vance during the hostage crisis were her own. They were made in direct and shocking violation of the life-saving protocols that all of our medical staff are rigorously trained to uphold. While one can perhaps speculate that her actions stemmed from a place of passion, the field of medicine demands discipline over passion. It demands procedure over impulse. It was a public execution. He didn't name her as suspended, but the implication was clear. He was a statesman of healthcare, solemnly reassuring the public while surgically excising the cancerous individual who had threatened the health of his organization. He had taken her desperate, life-saving act and branded it as a dangerous emotional whim. The reporter's questions began. "Mr. Davenport, are you saying the nurse made the situation worse?" "I am saying," Davenport replied smoothly, "that protocol exists to prevent a bad situation from becoming a tragic one. When protocol is ignored, the outcome is left entirely to chance. We, as an institution, do not believe in leaving lives to chance." The lie was so perfect, so complete, that it was almost beautiful in its wickedness. He had transformed the hospital's cowardice into a noble principle. Ellie felt a profound and terrifying sense of vertigo. The world was tilting, and she was sliding off. The police, her hospital, the media, the public one by one, the pillars of the world she had trusted were either crumbling or actively pushing her away. She was utterly and completely alone. With a trembling hand, she reached for the remote and turned off the television, plunging the room into silence. The phone on the coffee table buzzed again, a persistent, hateful little insect. She picked it up and held down the power button until the screen went black. She walked over to her internet modem and yanked the power cord from the wall. She stood in the center of her apartment, surrounded by a sudden, absolute quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the crushing, suffocating silence of a vacuum. The world had rendered its verdict, and in the space of a single day, Alara Vance had been erased, replaced by the reckless caricature of the paperclip nurse. The rage she had felt earlier had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold, heavy ash of despair. Her trial by public opinion was over. Now, she realized, the formal proceedings, the ones that would take her license and her future, were about to begin, and she would face them alone.